Welcome to part 1 of HDRI creation in Blender. In this first part, I am going to show you my setup for creating HDRI studio maps, and then in the next parts there are going to be more time-lapse showing you how to create different types of studio lights and HDRIs. So let's start with opening up a new scene, delete everything, and we're going to start with scene collections. So first one, we're going to rename this to cameras, then create a new collection, call this one lights, and then one more collection. This one is going to be instance. Okay, then we are gonna split our scene. First, bring this down, and then that. We want 4 windows. Now let's go to cameras and add 2 cameras at the origin. The first camera we're gonna call HDRI renderer. The second camera is going to be HDRI edit. And you can name it here too, HDRI edit. And let's take this HDRI render. Now make sure that you are in cycles as EV. This will not work. Let's take the HDRI edit and move it back so that we can use this as a view of the lighting. Then we switch over to the HDRI render and go to camera properties, change it to panoramic and equal rectangular. On the top left one, you can also go into camera view, switch in the properties. We go down to a view and local camera. We're going to change this to HDR render, and down here we're going to put this to HDR edit. Now we have this view locked into viewing and this view locked into the HDRI. The next thing is we want to only see the HDRI in here. So what we're going to do is let's just create a mesh plane and just turn it so that we have a reference. In this view, we want to see the plane, but in our HDRI, we don't want to see the plane. So what we're going to do is move this plane over to our lights, because we're going to be using planes for lights, images for lights, as the Blender light objects will not work for creating HDRIs. Let's just put this as box light. If we go over to collections, local collections, we can choose to hide collections. In this case, we do not want to see the lights. Now, we don't have any objects in there anymore. Before we go to the next step, I'm going to switch over to shader editor, and I'm just going to use Easy HDR to create a world setup, and just bring in some studio light, then Control B to restrict this render area to help us with our render times. Okay, So here we have our environment, and you can see this HDRI. This is what the current HDRI is and what it looks like. You can see there's no object obscuring the HDRI, but here we do. Before we start actually creating HDRIs, we are going to need some reference objects. For this, I'm going to use the Sketchfab plugin, and I'm just going to find some shoes and import these shoes. Let's scale those. Oops. Scale them down. And position them right at the origin, so they are at the center of the HDRI. Again, now that appeared in our HDRI, so we're gonna hide the leather shoes instance. We're almost done. In this viewport, we want to hide the lights, because if I turn this into a new emission shader so that I can use it as a light source, you'll see that I can use it as light source, but I can't see the shoes. And if we were to do the same thing here, where we hide the lights instance, let me just put this over here, you'll see that we also lose the light data. So the way that I got around this is, in my lights group, I have this box light. If I turn this into set undirect only, we see our shoes, but we no longer see our light in our HDRI. So what we have to do is, let's reveal that again, clear indirect only, and create a instance of this, put this instance into the instances, then turn the light's visibility back into indirect only. And over here we hide this instance layer, but we show the instance layer on our HDRI. So this lets us use this 3D viewport to add an infinite amount of objects, and these lights will get added to that instance since we are instancing the collection. And this is my setup for creating HDRIs. We have our first view that shows us our magnificent HDRI. We have our viewport with our object that's going to show us our lighting. We have our viewport for moving objects around, and we have our world setting where we can change the materials of the objects in the world. And the main reason for this is it's easy to switch between these two different backgrounds to go look at your HDRI after you've completed that. But I will go into detail in the next part for that. The final thing that I will put in this is the settings. So we'll go over to our scene, and I like to work with 5000 by 2500. This gives me a nice 2:1 ratio and high enough quality that you don't really see it in your reflections. Then we want to change the file format to radiance HDR. And the final thing for this one is we'll go over to leather shoes, and disable it from rendered view. So now when I hit render, we are going to get our very first HDR. Well, one last thing that I forgot to mention is that over on the instance, you might want to disable selection so that you don't have to worry about selecting the wrong object